And joining us right now to talk about Bill Pulte as acting director of national intelligence, proxy advisors, Iran negotiations, and much more is Tennessee Republican Senator Bill Hagerty. And Senator, thank you for being with us this morning.
Good to be with you, and welcome to Washington.
Thank you. We appreciate it. We've been talking a lot about why Washington is so important to business leaders, to companies everywhere. And one of the issues that you've really been fighting for for over a year at this point is the proxy services. Why don't you talk a little bit about why this is interesting? Because it can sound pretty arcane.
Becky, it's actually been longer than a year, but I think we're getting traction now. A year ago, I think,
was when you first wrote the letter in.
But the concern is something that dates back to my time in the private sector. I've served on NYSE, NASDAQ boards, and anybody, I think, that is involved in public companies is aware of what ISS and Glass Lewis do. It's a duopoly. They have enormous monopoly power. And
these are the companies that tell shareholders how to vote
exactly,
on
Becky.
management's proposals.
They're called proxy advisory firms. And it's an opportunity for companies, particularly those that manage a lot of passive investments, to lay off the responsibility of doing the due diligence themselves. And what they do is they rely on these proxy advisors to guide them in terms of how to vote. What we find, though, is that the proxy advisors are actually owned overseas, Canada, Switzerland. They're not American companies. They're using and misusing and abusing their power to achieve political objectives. They also basically operate as a racket. I was on the board of directors of the New York Stock Exchange traded company that got a recommend against. So a board of directors will put out their recommendations for a proxy. Here's how the board recommends voting. The proxy advisory firms come out, recommend for or against that. They recommended against us. In this particular case, it was say on pay. About a week later, our CEO gets a call from the consulting arm of the same proxy advisory firm that had recommended against us. Well, you can get right with us if you spend some money on our consulting firm. And so, it depends on the size.
So it felt like a shakedown.
Yeah, it's a total shakedown. Yeah. It's a total shakedown. It's corrupt. And if you look at what they're doing, and particularly who's influencing them, these are social investing activists that are getting involved in funding proxy advisory services to try to create an outcome that they could never achieve legislatively. And it's
or if the thing is, there are a lot of shareholders who are not active shareholders. Mm-hmm. They don't follow very closely what's happening. They listen to these proxy services to determine what happens. You've spoken with CEOs about this too.
I've spoken with a number of CEOs. I met with the Business Roundtable recently and went through what we're dealing with here in this situation. And there were so many heads nodding because they've experienced this. Again, it's a racket, it's a shakedown. And this is an opportunity, I think, for, again, activists to come in a side door and try to create influence. I think what it's doing, though, is it's putting pressure on the big funds that are basically passive investments to not rely on these funds, to actually do their own due diligence and decide what's going to be best for shareholders.
Can I ask you about what I would describe as maybe an adjacent issue, but it's in the news right now? I don't know if you focused on this at all. You're talking about duopolies. The New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ have been competing vigorously for the SpaceX IPO. SpaceX IPO ultimately went to the NASDAQ. One of the major reasons it went to the NASDAQ is because they changed the rules around the NASDAQ 100 index so that the SpaceX IPO will effectively be allowed into the index automatically. So that invariably...
Without the waiting period.
Without a waiting period, so that there's a forced buyer on day one, effectively, or within the first week, effectively, for that stock. So you know that these indexes buy, and then, by the way, everybody else who does a mimic index of that index has to buy the SpaceX IPO. So on one end, the company's looking to use an exchange. On the other end, NASDAQ is effectively changing the rules for its own index. And I ask what you, as somebody who in your seat, thinks about that, because as you were talking about the proxy players and sort of this idea of duopolies, I'm thinking about the duopoly of these two exchanges and the different conflicts of interest of the different sort of ancillary pieces that they own that they can use to try to move business around.
Yeah, now, this is the first I've heard of this rule change, as you mentioned it, Andrew. But again, I think anytime you have a duopoly in this particular situation, I think we need to take a very hard look at it and make certain that that power isn't being abused. This is something that I will look into much more deeply. Thank you for bringing it to my attention.
Because of the size that it's going to be in the index, you might as well do it.
Oh, it'll ultimately be in the index
You need the weighting,
in 3 months from now.
Right.
So typically, the way this would work is in 3 months from now, this stock would likely appear in that.
What I will say, the NASDAQ has said, we've asked Gina about this, the NASDAQ has said because it's such a large entity, you never had private companies like this waiting this long to go public.
It's like a case of first impression here, and the size of the IPO, that's correct.
And they want the business. Do it.
Well, but that's the point. They want the business.
I know.
And because you create a forced buyer.
If I could change the rule, I'd do it too. I'm sorry. I live in a real world.
Just to get the business.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and this
thoughts,
becomes
Senator?
the question. What do you think about that?
I think this certainly feels like, particularly as you laid it out, it certainly does mimic the concerns that I raised in the proxy advisory firm, but it doesn't have the same sort of
It doesn't have the political overtones. I agree.
Nefarious and political overtones. I think it's just a straightforward business decision, particularly if you know that it's going to wind up. The size of this IPO is unprecedented.
We're probably going to ask every senator we talk to today about Bill Pulte too. I know you know Mr. Pulte. We know him. I like him, and he's had a good career in a totally different arena. Does this make sense to you?
Well, here's what I think is important to understand. Again, Bill is a very high energy person.
He is.
He's as we say in the South, he knows how to get her done. He gets things accomplished. What he has done is he's earned the trust of the President of the United States. And I think that's critically important, particularly in an environment where intelligence agencies have been weaponized. And I think the President is trying to get to the bottom of this, trying to clear it out. And so Bill Pulte doesn't surprise me at all.
Put a guy in who can really deal in a weaponized environment or something?
What do you make of the argument, though, that he has sought to weaponize the system unto itself in the context of Lisa Cook? I mean, I think if Lisa Cook were here, if Letitia James was here, if Jay Powell was here, they would argue to you that he's weaponized the system.
Or Letitia?
Well, I think what you would argue if you were taking a 50,000-foot view is that he's leveling the playing field. Because those people that you just mentioned, Letitia James, Lisa Cook, I mean, I voted against her. I don't think she was qualified to be on the Federal Reserve Board. Letitia James is absolute disgrace. What happened in New York State, what continues to happen there in terms of her weaponization.
So you're talking about building up all sorts of weaponization the way we did the Cold War with Russia? Like everybody has to nuclear?
I mean, that's a question, whether that's sort of a retribution on either. It's sort of this sort of tit-for-tat retribution piece, and whether that is something that both is acceptable. I think the other issue about just the question, he may be very high energy, but from an intelligence perspective, given his experience, or rather lack of experience, how you think that works all the way down the line?
You know, I would differ with that strongly, and here's the reason. Before I came into the Senate, I was the United States Ambassador to Japan. We have an enormous military capability in Japan. In fact, the largest deployment of U.S. military overseas anywhere in the world is in Japan. We also have a very large intelligence operation there. I'm a business person. I had a very large intel operation that I was responsible for. My perspective on that was actually quite different. You know what I did every morning, every week, first part of the week, is I would have all of the intelligence agencies that reported to me meet in a skiff and explain what they were working on that week. Why? I wanted them to be aligned. I didn't want them spying on one another. I wanted them to work with each other and coordinate. That hadn't happened before. And that's because a business person just has a different perspective. And I think that's the type of approach that would be welcome here in Washington.
Senator Hagerty, thank you for your time this morning.
It's great to be with you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.